I've been saying that if you're going to take the AP exam, you basically could predict question one. Question one is always going to tell you something about the economy. It's going to ask you to graph it. It's going to ask you to talk about the fiscal policy. It's going to then ask you to do the monetary policy, and then talk about the impact of the money supply, and then talk about foreign exchange. So basically, you could basically get 30 of your points just by knowing how to graph. And so what we're going to look over today is, because a lot of our tests will be about the impact of graphing, we're going to go back and review before we do our free response questions and our multiple choice questions. So we are looking at does everybody says expansion phase of the business cycle?
Yes.
Okay, so what is, I want us to think in the expansion phase of the business cycle, what is our problem? Inflation is over what percent?
3.
Is over 3%. And this is really good to know, because a lot of times on the free response, they're going to tell you our economy is experiencing high inflation. Or like this one, assume the United States economy is operating less than at full employment. So what phase of the business cycle am I in? Contraction. Okay, my Roomba is stuck and it's near a cliff. I don't know what cliff in my house. Okay, assume a country's economy is at currently equilibrium. Right, so it will tell you where you need to be to start off your prompt. Okay, so now we know inflation is our problem. So it asks us here to graph aggregate demand and aggregate supply with inflation. So I know that this is going to be my price level. What is this axis right here? Real GDP. On a lot of these questions on AP, they give you 1 point for being able to label the axis. So there we go, we got a point. Then the next thing is we have to graph it with inflation, right? So this is my aggregate supply.
Do we have to do those, or can we do the straight lines?
You can do the straight lines. This is aggregate demand. And it wants me to graph for inflation. So which way does that curve go? Which curve moves to show inflation?
Demand.
The aggregate demand, which way does it move?
Left.
To the left.
No, that's right.
That's
To the right. Thank you. I just said whatever anybody told me.
That's how you get into bad situations, Miss Virginia.
I know.
You can't just follow what other people say. We can use Y.
We could use Y, because that will tell you the economy. So looking at this, just by showing the rightward shift, I got another point. And then do y'all see my little dotted lines? I showed that the price level went up and the output went up, right? I get another point for that. So do you see what's important to do on AP? You must label your axis. You must show the direction of the change, because all of this will add up to points. So I want us to look at fiscal policy. In fiscal policy, what tools will the government use to counteract this?
Taxes.
Okay, so less government spending, so government spending less. And what are we gonna do with taxes? So, on the AP exam, they're always gonna ask you to graph the impact. So over here, I'm gonna label my graph correct again, my price level, my real GDP. Where should I put my aggregate demand curve? On this lower end or the higher end? Higher end. So if I'm graphing the problem, I always have to put it on the higher end for inflation. Because of the government's use of these tools, which way does my aggregate demand curve go?
Left.
To the left.
To the left. Am I done with my graph?
No.
What do I need to do to make sure I show the analysis?
Dotted lines,
The
label.
dotted lines and label. If you do this on the AP test, you will get every single point needed. You label the and then you dotted your lines to show the analysis. Do y'all see how simple it is? Okay, so what we're gonna look at, because of contractionary, this was the fiscal policy they used, what happened to aggregate demand? Because they used these tools, what happened to aggregate demand? It decreased. What happened to GDP? GDP went what? Here's 1 and here's 2.
Down.
It went down. What happened to price level? Price level went down. What happened to inflation? It went down. What happened to unemployment? Remember, this one is always gonna go counter. So if aggregate demand goes down, GDP goes down, price level goes down, inflation goes down, unemployment is gonna go up. Because the government is taking in money in taxes, do they run a surplus or a shortage? And oftentimes they're gonna ask you what happened to aggregate demand because of this policy. We know everything goes the same way except unemployment. So now, we have to graph the problem, but this one's gonna ask us to do it with aggregate demand, short-run aggregate supply, and long-run aggregate supply. What gap should I have to graph the problem? I need to have an expansionary gap or inflationary gap. So I'm gonna draw everything at equilibrium. Do y'all know how does it look at equilibrium? I think-
Equal?
It looks like a star, right?
Yeah, I didn't know what answer you were looking for. I was like, it's even, it's
It's
equal.
even, I messed up right there.
I'm gonna start changing the way I draw my E's just to
Throw me up.
throw you off.
Okay, which way would I show an inflationary or expansionary gap? Which way does the triangle need to be from equilibrium? To the right. Which curve do I move? Aggregate demand, because I'm trying to create demand pull inflation. Do y'all now see my expansionary gap?
Yes.
Oh, someone has messed with mine. Dang. So now this is my problem. An inflationary gap. Is this graph basically the same thing as this graph? Does it both show inflation?
Yes.
Yes, but sometimes they're gonna ask you just to do it with the aggregate demand, aggregate supply. But if they ask you to do it with long run, here is it is, but they're the same exact things. Okay, so the next thing, if the government uses the tools of decreased government spending and increase of taxes, what should happen to my graph? It moves back to what? Equilibrium. So then the solution is that if they use these things, here's my price level, here's real GDP, everything will go back to equilibrium, right? Not do a very good line, so this line's extra thick. The effects of the policies is that everything will go back to equilibrium. So if I did my 81, 82, that would show it going back to equilibrium.
It would be, need to show it going back.
If it asked you to. Because sometimes they were like, go back to the graph you did in part B and show the new impact. Okay? And it tells you exactly what you need to do. And so it's just like, that's why I keep on saying maybe you should take the test. I know it's 4 months from now, but they basically tell you what to do when we look at the prompts. Okay? So now what we're gonna look at is Phillips curve. We just did the Phillips curve. Y'all remember my notes?
Yes.
That were very nice. Okay?
Oh, that was with the
those were the very condescending notes.
Snarky ones.
Yes.
Push the meaning out.
Okay, so what do I label this axis on the Phillips curve? I for inflation. And then I labeled this curve what? U, bless you. Okay, what does the I represent? Inflation, what does the U represent?
Unemployment.
Unemployment. So I need to show the problem. So how does my Phillips curve go?
It's Mary.
Right? Where would I put my job, my dot, where would I put my dot to show that I'm in an expansion?
Towards the left side.
Towards the right.
Why over here? Why do I have to put I have high inflation and low what?
Unemployment.
This shows me that I am in an expansion. Okay, again, if the government taxes, right, and the government decreases spending, I need to graph how it would impact the Phillips curve. So my original point is right here, right? Point A. If the government were to do that, tax more, would I be up here on point A? No, where would I go? Up the curve or down the curve? I would go down the curve.
You need to do the dotted lines and like label them and everything. So I want.
I
I'm
one,
just saying,
yes, cause I was incomplete. I2, U1, U2.
You too.
Not to be confused with the band.
Yeah.
Everyone knows that band. It's almost like they forcibly put their music on your phone.
They really?
Okay,
Yeah.
They force downloaded like 3 of their albums onto like every iPhone at one point.
Really?
Oh, that's unusual.
Yeah.
I don't listen to these people at all.
I've never heard of that.
And it's like it's difficult to delete it.
Really? I've never listened to them on my phone.
Yeah.
It was a while ago though,
Okay.
wasn't it
It was
like
like
10
5
years
years
ago?
It was a couple years ago. Yeah.
years.
Okay.
They used to have them.
Maybe
At
like
least
4.
5.
Sorry, Sarah on the other side. She's like, you do. Okay.
She knows who U2 is.
Okay. I'm gonna flip it over because there's a backside.
It was 2014.
2014.
5 years ago.
I just had a kid, so I probably don't know anything that was happening outside that's in the real news.
What do you consider real news?
Like what?
Not the fake
Like
news.
not the fake news, yes, because I don't listen to the fake news. Okay. So what we're gonna now look at is loanable funds. In an expansion, I'm bringing up monetary policy. In an expansion, what policy does the Fed run? Are they gonna tighten up the money supply or ease up the money supply? So they're gonna run tight, or we know contractionary.
Bless you,
Kevin.
Monetary
You are welcome.
policy. So what are they gonna do with the discount rate? They wanna tighten it up,
Yeah.
so
No, up.
raise.
Yeah, up.
What are they gonna do with the reserve requirement?
Raise it.
Raise it. What are they gonna do with the open market operations of government bonds? Okay, think about this. Do they sell? They give it to you and they take your money? Or do they buy it and give you money?
They buy it. We know.
When
They
you
sell it.
buy, they give you money.
They
Is that
sell
gonna
it.
tighten up the money supply?
They wanna take money away so
So
that
they
it's not-
sell.
No bonds.
They sell. Remember, this is what we had issues with last test,
It's
buy
always
and
been
sell.
easier for me, like, thinking of it, like, what do they wanna do with the money?
Yes, they
and
want-
what do they do?
So they have to big it the other way. Okay, so what we're gonna do is graph the expansion with the original loanable funds graph. So here it is, and here's the demand for money. Okay. So, do y'all remember how my money curve looks?
It's a straight line.
Why is my money curve a straight line?
There's only so much at a time.
It's constant, right? So here's my original interest rate. With the government increasing the reserve requirement discount rate and selling, the money supply will what? Will it increase or decrease?
Decrease.
So which way does my curve go?
Down.
So the left thing?
To the left. So then what happened to the interest rate?
I don't know.
The interest rate went up, so would people borrow?
No.
No. So if the interest rate goes up, the money supply will go down. So this next one, they never ask people to graph for this, usually. Here's my money supply, right? My interest rate was really high. How do people react with that high interest rate? Do they demand as much? No, so the demand curve goes which way? They never asked for this curve, but now, because people start demanding less, what happens to the interest rate? It'll fall. But usually, you will never have to graph. You'll never have to graph. Because they'll ask you what happens to people's demand for money, and the demand for money will go what? It will decrease. So we will always have to write the demand for money will decrease. It usually always asks. Okay, so because of the Fed policy, what will happen to loanable funds? What happened to loanable funds here? It went down. What happened to the interest rate? It went up. What happened to the money market? It went down. The money in the market went down. So, does the government need money in an expansion? No, because the government spending goes what?
Down.
Down. So the government, is its hand in the money supply or is it out of the money supply? Out. So the government borrowing is going to be called crowding in. Crowding in makes funds available for I. Do y'all remember what I is? Business. Do y'all remember C plus I plus G plus XN?
No.
No? Do y'all remember what I is? Business.
Yes.
Plus C. Do y'all remember what C is?
What's that?
Consumers.
What's this IG thing?
It's just because we have to differentiate from the interest. Alright, so if now funds are available for businesses, we gotta talk about what the impact on the PPC is. Do y'all remember the PPC?
Yes.
Okay.
Possibilities occur.
Okay, so production possibilities curve, so I'm gonna put capital over here. I'm gonna put consumer over here. How does that curve look?
Demand
Um,
down.
Yeah. It's an outward.
Yeah, it's a line,
There we
yeah.
go.
Oh, that one.
Do y'all remember that one as
Yes.
the first graph?
That was a long time ago.
We're connecting it all together
Oh,
now.
that's the cookies and cakes.
Cookies and cakes.
There we go.
Cookies and cakes graph.
Or the cucumbers and pickles.
Oh, yeah.
Are cucumbers and pickles
Yeah, how's the
effectively
farm
the
doing?
same thing?
It's raining.
So is that good or bad for cucumber production?
We like humidity. You need humidity for your pickles your cucumbers to grow.
Well, it's pickle, it's pickling season, so.
Yeah. Okay, so
She's done.
I'm sorry, the pickle farm. Okay. If now there's more money for businesses to borrow, because the government is not borrowing, what should happen to this PPC?
It should go
It should go out. because there's more money available. Sorry, my lines were horrible.
We forgive you.
Okay, so the impact, so we're gonna see the impact as it increases the PPC, which is that good for a country?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, so the lasting impact on long-run aggregate supply, so this curve relates to long-run aggregate supply. So this is price level, and this is real GDP. If this PPC goes outward, I'm gonna put everything at equilibrium. If now the government has made more money available by crowding in businesses, which curve is gonna move?
The
Long run.
long run.
Right?
Can long run move first?
No.
No.
What has to
But-
move first?
Short.
Short run, if there's more available money now, but even though interest is high, but it's because the government's not borrowing, they're out, their hand is out allowing to crowd in businesses, which curve moves first? Short run, so which way does it move?
To the right.
To the right. So then what happens to my long run? It then moves. But look what happened to price. Price did what? When the government allows for businesses to borrow, price would do what?
Go down.
Prices go down, and then output goes up by allowing borrowing to occur. We've just related all of our curves together. Are y'all getting them? I have one more thing, and this is our next unit, Unit 6, about exports and imports and net exports and everything with dealing with exchange. We will do that later. Are y'all okay?
Yes.
Okay, somewhat. This was a lot. So now let's look at a contraction.
We didn't even. Oh wait, I'm oblivious.
Huh? What?